The billionaire hid under the table to test his employee. What he heard shattered his world. No one inside the sleek, sunlit office suspected anything unusual that morning. The city skyline glimmered through the tall glass windows, the hum of success lingering in the air like a quiet promise. The office was spotless, modern, carefully curated to reflect power and professionalism. And yet, hidden beneath the polished wooden desk at the center of the room, something unbelievable was happening. Beneath that desk sat Edward Hawley, one of the youngest self-made billionaires in the country. His tailored, navy blue suit, usually seen in boardrooms and private jets, now brushed against the cool white floor tiles. His silver hair was neatly combed as always, his trimmed beard immaculate, but his eyes were wide, alert, and unblinking. He sat cross-legged, knees pulled in, trying to keep absolutely still. This was not a prank. This was not a joke. This was a test. Edward Hawley had built his empire from nothing. No inheritance. No shortcuts. Just relentless work, discipline, and a belief that character mattered more than credentials. Over the years, however, whispers had begun to reach him, quiet complaints, subtle warnings, uncomfortable pauses during meetings. People change when you're not in the room. That sentence had lodged itself deep into his mind. So today, for the first time in his life, Edward decided to see the truth with his own eyes and ears. Above him, completely unaware, sat Laura Mitchell, his senior executive assistant. Laura was efficient, polished, and always smiling. Her white, button-up blouse was crisp, sleeves rolled neatly at the wrists. Her hair was pulled back into a tidy ponytail, her posture confident as she leaned back in her ergonomic chair. Phone pressed to her ear. She laughed lightly. Edward froze. Laura never laughed like that during work calls. Her tone wasn't professional. It wasn't careful. It was relaxed, comfortable, almost careless. Edward's heart began to pound. From beneath the desk, he could see her shoes tapping softly against the floor. He could hear every breath, every shift of her chair, every word echoing far louder than she could possibly imagine. "No, he won't be back until later," Laura said casually into the phone. "Trust me, he never checks in without warning." Edward swallowed hard. Never checks in without warning. That wasn't true. He checked everything. Always had. Laura spun her chair slightly, crossing her legs, her voice dropping just enough to feel private. "You wouldn't believe how easy it is," she continued, chuckling. "People think he's a genius, but honestly, he trusts too much." Edward's fingers curled into fists. This was already more than he expected. He had hidden under the table hoping to hear harmless office gossip, mild complaints, maybe a bit of frustration. Nothing more than human weakness. But this was different. The woman he had defended in board meetings. The woman he had promoted twice. The woman he trusted with his schedule, his emails, his confidential documents. She was talking about him like he wasn't even human. Laura leaned forward, lowering her voice further. "Listen," she said, her tone suddenly serious. "Once the merger goes through, things will shift. I'll make sure I'm positioned well. You won't even see it coming." Edward's breath caught in his throat. Merger? Positioned? He won't see it coming? The room felt smaller, the air heavier. Edward pressed his back against the desk leg, every muscle in his body tense, fighting the urge to move, to stand, to confront her right then and there. But he stayed silent, because something deep inside him whispered a terrifying truth. This was only the beginning of what he was about to hear. Above him, Laura laughed again, lighter this time, almost carefree, and beneath the table, the billionaire realized that the greatest risk he had ever taken was not in business, but in trusting the wrong person. The silence beneath the desk became unbearable. Edward Hale's heartbeat thundered in his ears, each pulse echoing louder than the last. He pressed his palm flat against the floor, grounding himself, reminding himself why he was here. This wasn't about anger. It wasn't about revenge, it was about truth. Above him, Laura's chair rolled slightly backward. The soft scrape of its wheels against the floor felt deafening. Edward held his breath, afraid even the smallest movement might give him away. Laura sighed into the phone. The kind of sigh reserved for people who felt completely safe. "You know," she said, lowering her voice with a hint of amusement. "Sometimes I wonder how he even got this far." Edward's jaw tightened. She laughed again, softer this time, almost indulgent. "Don't get me wrong, he works hard. But people like him? They think loyalty is permanent. That kindness buys silence." Edward's stomach twisted. Kindness. He remembered the day Laura had joined the company fresh out of a smaller firm. Nervous, unsure. He had personally welcomed her, told her he valued honesty above all else. He had given her chances others wouldn't have. And now, those same qualities were being used against him. Laura leaned back in her chair, spinning a pen between her fingers. Edward could see its shadow moving across the floor. "I've seen the files," she continued. "The offshore accounts, the silent partnerships. If anyone ever looked closely enough," she paused, then chuckled. "But they won't, because I control what they see." Edward's breath hitched. That wasn't just betrayal. That was leverage. For the first time since hiding under the desk. Fear crept into his chest, not fear of exposure, but fear of how deeply his company might already be compromised. Laura's tone shifted, growing more confident, more calculating. "Once the board signs off next month, my position becomes untouchable. And if he ever questions me?" She scoffed. "I'll smile, nod, pretend I'm grateful. Just like always." Edward closed his eyes, every smile, every polite "thank you." Every moment he thought he was mentoring someone loyal. All of it felt poisoned now. Laura stood up suddenly, heels clicking sharply against the floor. Edward flinched instinctively, his shoulder brushing the underside of the desk. She walked toward the window, her reflection faintly visible in the glass. "People like him think power protects them," she said into the phone. "But power makes them blind. He trusts systems. He trusts people. That's the weakness." Edward felt something crack inside him. Not rage. Disappointment. The kind that sinks deeper than anger ever could. He had spent years believing that culture mattered, that if you built something with integrity, the people inside it would reflect that. But here he was, sitting on a cold floor, listening to someone dismantle his faith word by word. Laura turned back toward the desk, lowering her voice again. "Anyway," she said lightly, "I should get back to work. Wouldn't want to look suspicious." Edward's pulse spiked. She stepped closer, much closer. From beneath the desk, Edward could now see her shoes, perfectly immaculate, expensive, paid for with a salary he had personally approved. She placed a folder on the desk. Inside it were documents Edward recognized instantly, confidential, sensitive, restricted. His chest tightened. She wasn't just talking. She was already acting. Laura picked up her phone again, her tone suddenly sweet and professional. "Yes, of course," she said, smiling. "I'll handle it." She hung up and let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head as if amused by a private joke. Edward realized then that this test had gone far beyond what he intended. He had hidden under the table expecting to hear careless words. Instead, he had uncovered a fracture at the very heart of his empire. And the worst part? Laura still had no idea that beneath her feet sat the man she believed was blind, powerless, and absent. No idea that every word she spoke was reshaping her future. Edward slowly opened his eyes, staring at the desk leg inches from his face. "Stay hidden," he told himself, because if he revealed himself now, he would lose something far more valuable than his temper. He would lose the chance to see just how deep this betrayal truly went. And above him, Laura returned to her computer. completely unaware that the man she underestimated was already planning his next move. Edward Halley did not move for a long time after Lavra returned to her computer. He stayed beneath the desk, breathing slowly, forcing his racing thoughts into order. The polished wood above his head felt suddenly heavier, as if the entire weight of the company pressed down on him. Through that single piece of furniture, he had come here expecting discomfort. He had found corruption. When Lavra finally stood up and left the office heels, fading down the corridor, Edward remained where he was, listening carefully until the sound disappeared completely. Only then did he shift his legs, wincing as stiffness shot through his knees. He crawled out slowly, quietly, as if the room itself might be watching him. Standing up, he adjusted his navy suit, smoothing the jacket with hands that trembled just slightly. The reflection in the glass wall caught his eye. The man staring back looked older than he remembered, eyes sharper, heavier, burdened by knowledge he could never unhear. Edward exhaled. "So that's how it is," he murmured, but instead of anger, something colder settled in his chest. Resolve. Edward did not confront Lavra. He did not call the board. He did not expose what he had heard. Instead, he began the second phase of his test. Within hours, subtle changes rippled through the company, quiet enough to avoid attention, deliberate enough to reveal patterns. A confidential memo was sent to only 3 executives, Lavra included. It contained false but convincing information about an upcoming acquisition, complete with altered figures and fabricated timelines. A trap. Edward watched from the shadows. By the next morning, whispers had already begun. No one inside the sleek, sunlit office suspected anything unusual that morning. A junior analyst mentioned hearing about the new acquisition in a conversation she shouldn't have been part of. A department head asked cautious questions that mirrored the language from the fake memo, almost word for word. Leak was spreading, and it was spreading fast. Edward sat in his private office, reviewing internal message logs, access timestamps, and communication trails. Years ago, he would have delegated this task. Today, he did it himself. The pattern was unmistakable. Every trail led back to Lavra. Not directly, she was far too careful for that, but through subtle nudges, offhand remarks, and strategically shared concerns. She didn't send documents. She planted ideas. Edward felt a grim respect. She was good. Too good. 3 days later, Edward announced a surprise leadership meeting. No agenda. No warning. The conference room filled quickly. Lavra arrived last, calm and composed, her expression politely curious. She took her seat across from Edward, folding her hands neatly on the table. Edward studied her quietly. She met his gaze without hesitation. "Thank you all for coming on short notice," Edward said evenly. "I won't keep you long." Lavra smiled faintly, as if amused by the mystery. "I want to talk about trust," Edward continued. "Not as a concept, as a practice." Several executives shifted uncomfortably. Edward leaned back in his chair. This company was built on the idea that power should be earned and protected by integrity. That information is a responsibility, not a currency. Lavra nodded along. The perfect image of agreement. Edward's eyes never left her. "In the last week," he said, "I've seen evidence that some people view information differently." Silence. The air in the room tightened. Laura's smile didn't falter. But Edward noticed something else, a barely perceptible tension in her shoulders. The kind that came from alertness, not guilt. She was calculating. Edward continued. "So I ran a test." Laura's eyes flickered, just once. "Some of you received information that was not real," Edward said calmly. "A scenario designed to see how information moved through this organization." A murmur rippled around the table. Edward placed his hands flat on the table. "What I found was disappointing." Lavra finally spoke. "With respect, Edward," she said smoothly. False information can spread unintentionally. People talk. That doesn't always mean bad intent. Edward smiled. A slow, knowing smile. You're right, he said. Which is why intent isn't what interests me. Lovra tilted her head slightly. Then what does? Patterns. The word landed like a hammer. Edward pressed a button on the remote. The screen behind him lit up not with names, but with diagrams, flowcharts, arrows, timelines. Information movement. Every path converged. Laura's breath caught. Almost inaudibly, Edward stood. This meeting is not about punishment, he said. It's about clarity. And clarity always reveals itself eventually. He turned off the screen. We're done here. The executives filed out slowly, confused and uneasy. Lovra remained seated for a moment longer, her expression carefully neutral. As she stood, Edward spoke again. Lovra. She turned, meeting his eyes. Yes? For someone who values control, Edward said quietly. You underestimate silence. She searched his face, trying to read something, anything, but Edward gave her nothing. She nodded once and left. That night. Edward stayed late, long after the building emptied. He walked the quiet halls alone, listening to the echo of his footsteps. He entered Laura's office not illegally, not secretly, but as the owner of everything within those walls. He sat at her desk. Opened her files. What he found went deeper than he expected. Shell companies, consulting contracts, quiet transfers disguised as efficiency restructuring. None of it illegal on its own. Together, it formed a slow bleed, millions siphoned over years, hidden behind layers of plausible deniability. Edward closed his eyes. This wasn't greed. This was entitlement. Lovra hadn't just betrayed him. She had decided the company was already hers. Edward leaned back, staring at the ceiling. I gave you everything, he whispered. And yet, even now, he didn't feel the urge to destroy her publicly. He wanted something else. Understanding. Why someone given trust would treat it as weakness. The following week, Edward made one final move. He announced that he would be stepping back temporarily, appointing Laura as acting head of operations. The reaction was immediate. Congratulations, applause, admiration. Laura accepted with visible humility, thanking Edward for his continued trust. Edward watched her carefully as she spoke, and there it was, flicker of triumph. Small. Human. Damning. As the room applauded, Edward clapped along slowly, his expression unreadable. Because Lovra had just stepped exactly where he wanted her. Into the light, into responsibility, into a position where every decision would be seen, recorded, and judged, and most importantly, where she would finally believe she had won. Edward turned away, already planning the final phase, the one that would not just expose betrayal, but redefine what power truly meant. Edward Hawley watched the applause fade as if it were a tide pulling back from the shore. Faces returned to their polite masks, conversations softened, and life inside the company resumed its familiar rhythm. On the surface, nothing had changed. Beneath it, everything had. Laura moved through her new role with confidence that bordered on elegance. She arrived early, left late, and spoke with authority that felt earned. Decisions were made quickly. Policies shifted. Departments were optimized. To anyone watching from the outside, she looked like the future of the company, sharp, composed, unstoppable. Edward stayed distant by design. He observed from quiet places, reports sent directly to him, security logs reviewed at night, recordings of meetings he never attended. He saw patterns repeat themselves with increasing boldness. Lovra no longer whispered suggestions. She issued directives. She no longer tested limits. She assumed them. And with every step she took forward, the ground beneath her weakened. The first crack appeared during a vendor negotiation. Lavra approved a contract without realizing the firm was one Edward himself had quietly flagged weeks earlier. The second came when she reassigned a team that handled compliance, replacing experience with loyalty. Each decision alone seemed harmless. Together, they formed a chain. Edward waited. The breaking point came on an ordinary Thursday. Lavra stood before the board, presenting quarterly results. Her voice was steady, her posture flawless. The numbers looked strong at first glance, but Edward had ensured something else was hidden in the room. Context. He entered quietly, taking a seat at the far end of the table. Lavra noticed him mid-sentence. For the briefest moment, her voice faltered. She recovered quickly. Edward let her finish. When she sat down, he stood. "I'd like to add something," he said calmly. The room stilled. Edward tapped the screen, replacing Laura's charts with his own. The data unfolded slowly, deliberately. Overlapping timelines. Financial paths looping back on themselves. Decisions that now had names attached to them. Laura's face drained of color. "This," Edward said softly, "is what happens when control replaces responsibility." She stood abruptly. "You set me up." Edward met her gaze. "No, I gave you space." The silence that followed was heavy, final. Lavra tried to speak again, but the words failed her. For the first time, there was no strategy left to deploy, no room to maneuver. The truth had nowhere else to go. Edward turned to the board. "This company does not belong to ambition alone. It belongs to trust. And trust does not survive in shadows." Lavra left the room without another word. Later that evening, Edward returned to the office where it had all begun. The desk was still there. The space beneath it empty now, unremarkable to anyone else. He knelt briefly, touching the floor where he had once listened in silence. Sometimes, the smallest places reveal the largest truths. Edward stood, straightened his jacket, and turned off the light. The test was over, and the lesson would last far longer than the fall that followed.